Thanks, Chris. Tonight, very informal chat. You guys get to ask you questions there. Busy month.
It is.
Right? Yeah.
Was. November now.
November the 1st. But before I get into the, to Ygap and Polished Man, can we go back a bit and give me a little bit of context and your background? I usually ask this question, well, I do every time, is there a mother or father who was entrepreneur? In this case, there very much was.
Not an entrepreneur.
No?
No, social advocate, but neither were entrepreneurial. But no, obviously...
Just go with me. Go with me a little bit. You got to give me something.
No, I guess had a unique childhood, growing up with parents that were very socially motivated. A father that lived and served in St Kilda, and a lot of his ministry was serving prostitutes, drug addicts, homeless people. So our kitchen table conversations were often filled with wonderful strangers. I never knew that was abnormal until I got to high school, and then invited a few friends over to stay one weekend, and a schizophrenic guy, Peter Jones, came over just to see if Dad was home, and Dad wasn't home. I opened the door, let Peter in, we had a cup of tea, and it's really gobsmacked my friends, the 13, 14-year-olds, that couldn't believe that this guy who was an alcohol abuser, but also suffered serious mental illnesses and was chronically homeless, was in our house. So that was interesting to learn, but it sows very strong sort of threads of DNA at a young age. I guess I rejected that as a teenager. Thought, why on earth is my dad such a social advocate, goody two-shoes, and I just wanted him to be normal, an accountant or a doctor or something. It wasn't until I probably grew up a little bit and realised that the decisions he made in his life to care for the most vulnerable people in this community in Melbourne, which then spanned to his work at World Vision, caring for people in the worst human disaster zones around the world, was something I became proud of.
So, yeah, it's crazy. Like my cousin had schizophrenia and hung himself, just so I know a little bit about it. Moving forward, and we're going to get on an upbeat path, don't worry. But so you said you had this kind of you weren't. I mean, you kind of pushed back on it, and then what? Did you go to university? What was your education?
I was talking to Monica. I was studying commerce arts, and I guess traditional university education, enjoyed parts of it, skipped the rest of it. I wouldn't say that was overly formative. My education came through travel. Certain people have different desires throughout their early adulthood, save up, buy a house, buy a car. Mine was a desire to travel and see the world. And I was fortunate at 19 to go spend 3 months in both Israel and Palestine. Worked at a school, Iberline, that was the first school in the occupied territories that educated Jews, Christians and Muslims. The year that I was there, they had the first Jewish student enroll. Historically, they had Muslims and Christians. And that was very formative. It really inspired me to study more about Middle Eastern culture, Middle Eastern history, Middle Eastern religion. But then finishing sort of university, I followed a traditional path. I got a job at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I regretted it a few weeks later once I started at PwC, and I was in auditing. I do apologise to any auditors here tonight, but it is the boringest job on earth. And
we're trying to get a sponsorship with them. Thanks. Yeah,
but there was a social thread that had been sowed, and even working full-time in an accounting profession like PwC, which was great for professional development and training, I was passionate about other things. And it was almost living a double life, sort of navigating my way through starting a volunteer organisation at 23, but in need of an income working in the corporate sector.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you've got a lot of entrepreneurs, startups here tonight, and I think you've got the majority of the entrepreneurs seem to have this path where they got this corporate thing that they don't love, so this kind of side hustle, as referred to now. And then when did you decide to take the plunge and go, I'm just going to do what I love?
Not till 4.5 years in. So we built Ygap as a volunteer organisation. We had programs in 5 countries across Africa and Asia. And the moment came, besides working full-time in both accounting and then later finance, when I had a major donor offer us $10,000 at a fundraising event that we ran, and he said, the only reason I'm not going to give you $100,000 is because you don't have any paid staff. And I just would like to know the protocols and the accountability around if I gave you a $100,000 check, how you would implement that money. And I said, well, Danny, give me the $100,000 check, then we can employ someone. So it was a catch-22 of a group of friends at a young age, sort of early 20s, starting a non-profit, running it for 4 years, and then probably maturing. And we'd turned over our first $1 million before we even employed someone. So it got to a certain stage of growth where the capacity of these young Australians was so stretched, and the team would have been 50 or 60 volunteers at that stage. But we, I guess, loved the equality, loved the volunteer nature of it, probably loved the immaturity behind it and the irreverence. But it was 2013 when we sat down as a management team and made that decision to employ someone, and then stepped out of the corporate sector into the non-profit sector and never looked back.
So it was always Ygap? There was nothing in between?
For me,
yeah.
Well, I worked in the corporate sector in 3 different jobs whilst building Ygap, but Ygap was concurrent to working in the corporate sector, and then full-time since 2013.
So, well, usually I'm asking because, entrepreneurs most times have some sort of failure in there. So this is good.
No, we failed. I think, we failed at a lot of stuff. I mean, I never stand up and just tell success stories. We've had volunteers' lives threatened on the verge of a couple of volunteers nearly being killed in Ghana. And Patrick O'Callaghan, our programs manager at the time, and I were up every night, 5 nights a week, trying to negotiate our volunteers being negotiated out of a hostile situation where young kids were being released out of the trafficking industry, miscommunication, cultural misunderstanding led our volunteers to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a pretty hostile environment. From a fundraising perspective, we launched a water company probably even before Thank You existed, with a group in Sydney called AdWater. It was Australia's first biodegradable water bottle. It was a beautiful, sexy, phenomenal product, but the cost of getting off the ground was too high. Our market price was about $1.70 wholesale. It's about, when that goes to market, it's $3.40 up to $3.70. So Australia wasn't willing to pay $3.70 back in 2009, and now we can't get a bottle for under $4. But that failed. That cost us $50,000 as a small charity and 2 volunteers' time for a year. We've had programs at schools that haven't worked, other fundraising initiatives, partnerships across Africa and Asia that haven't worked. So there's a lot of learning in there and failing, but that makes you stronger.
Can I go back a little bit? So you're working at these various corporate jobs, but you had a couple of founders by the sound of it. There was a few of you guys.
Correct.
Everyone was working in corporate jobs?
Not corporate. We've always had a very diverse background. Yeah. Nurses, teachers, designers, academics, people like myself, more white collar, but all types of walks of life. And it was very democratised around whatever skill set you had if you wanted to contribute. It was a youth movement, much like the Oak Tree Foundation, Reach Foundation. It was another youth movement from sort of 2008 to 2012 before we sort of stepped into our realm as late 20s and formalised the organisation.
And was it a case of in between, just on your holidays, going and visiting these places?
Yep. So, basically every bit of annual leave I had was in the field, going to Malawi, Rwanda, Ghana, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and seeing our work. And so you have traditional 4 weeks a year, get out to the field as often as possible. Ygap didn't pay for me to go to the field once until probably 2012, maybe 2013. So we were just passionate and crazy enough to spend our own time and money doing it. But we loved it. For us, spending 3-4 weeks in Malawi was better than being in the west coast of America.
Well, tell me about that. Tell me about some of these early adventures you had. We're here for almost an hour. So please tell me a little bit about maybe why you chose these places and some of the cool things you did.
One story that comes to mind is an interesting social experiment we had to run in Malawi. So Malawi is the first place we worked. I'm here by accident, and I'm very honest about that. We never intended to run a charity. A group of friends and I wanted to volunteer in Africa. We looked at different international volunteering opportunities and were pretty annoyed and discomforted by the fact that there's exorbitant fees attached to volunteering. $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, sometimes $6,000 per person per program. So for anyone here that's wanted to volunteer overseas, you've probably come across these intermediaries. They exist for good reasons. If you're an 18, 19-year-old and you want to go volunteer in certain parts of the world, there is a program or there's a structure. It gives parents some type of comfort and support. But for us who had travelled prior, we just didn't see a need to pay $4,000 per person for 10 friends. It's $40,000 to an intermediary before you even get to the field, and there's no donation there. So we said, well, why don't we cut out the middleman and do it ourselves? So we contacted a few local grassroots organisations and formed 2 partnerships, one in Malawi and one in Ghana. We said, this is who we are. These are the skill sets we've got. We had a couple of builders, designers, a couple of nurses, one auditor, and said, what would you do if we came to you and gave you a $50,000 check? Fast forward nearly 9 years now, you still get a very quick response from small NGOs in Africa when you offer $50,000. But the first partnership we formed was with a group, Malawian local organisation, and we've always been very focused on working with local organisations. And this group, Build a School Co. They worked in a place called Ngwenya, just outside the capital, Lilongwe. And so we flew into Malawi. We fundraised prior to going. 2008 was when we launched, September 2008. Now, for those working or in recent history would know very well that 2008 was the global financial crisis. And so we launched the worst business model possible during a GFC, a non-profit. And so whilst the global markets took a turn for the worse, the Australian dollar pegged to the US dollar dropped from 94 US cents to 67 US cents in 6 weeks. It's sort of a market capitulation that has never been experienced since the Great Depression. So we are running around Melbourne as volunteers and a group of friends, and no one's been to Africa, selling a vision to people about going to Africa and working on these 2 projects. Fortuitous to our endeavour and I guess passion, we fundraised $134,000 in 2 months through events, a few corporates, family and friends. And then we got to Malawi and had committed $50,000 to the first school. It was a school that educated 6,672 students in 12 dilapidated classrooms.
What the hell?
So it's always interesting going and speaking at schools and hearing the standard issue, complaint around oversized classrooms, 30, 35 kids. The Ngwenya Primary School had 3,300 students come in at 6 a.m. They'd receive an education till about 11:45 a.m. The teachers would get a half an hour break, and then the next 3,300 students would come in from 12:15 right through to 6 p.m. And the teachers are working 11 half-hour days. So even 3,300 students do not fit in 12 classrooms. So a lot of the classes are held on the perimeter of the school. So whenever it rained or it was too hot, kids are sent home and denied a day's education. So we increased the school's infrastructure by 33%, a small project. Our issue was we had no idea that Malawian kwacha was pegged to the US dollar. So we went over there and did our budgets in sort of August, September, got there, had that $50,000 commitment. By the time we started expensing it and funding this project with Build a School, the program, the infrastructure cost 74,000 Australian dollars. So we ran out of money. Now, our other money for Ghana was pre-committed and already sent. So here's a group of 10 Australians who had promised their family and friends and a bunch of corporates. A guy that gave us money, Peter Cooper from Cooper's Investors, is in the top 50 richest Australians, still backs us to the day. But we took money from someone like that. And we're in Africa scratching our heads going, we actually can't finish this school. We hadn't got the roofs on the trusses, and therefore the school was exposed. And a bad development model, a really bad development model, and type of thing that can cause a lot of community issues. So we looked around the group, and to get the roofs on, we had one family come to the party and give us a bit of funding, but we had an $8,000 shortfall that we had to fill in 48 hours. And we're without any decent internet in Lilongwe, Malawi. And Malawi, for anyone that's been to Africa, Malawi is probably East Africa 30, 40 years ago. So there's no traffic lights in the capital city. It's called the warm heart of Africa, the most friendly, vibrant, remarkable people. But it's underdeveloped and very poor for African standards. So I looked around the group, and we had a mixture of male and females, and I looked at Louise Atkins. She's an Australian, Italian, gorgeous, long, black flowing hair. And I said, Lou, that's a nice set of hair you've got. She goes, you're not. And so we flicked a note on Facebook and said, look, if we can raise $8,000 in 48 hours, we'll shave Lou's head. And we did. Her two biggest donors were her two ex-boyfriends. They donated $1,000 each just to see Lou with a shaved head. But that type of ingenuity and innovation which enabled us to finish the project and hand the school over and head off to Ghana was an interesting formative experience. But that Back Against Your Wall fundraising still exists today. Orion's here, who's organised the event with you, has worked with us for the last 6 months on a Polished Man campaign, knows that even though we've got staff now and systems in different countries with a great team around the world, you're constantly chasing your tail in this sector. And it's sad because it's important work that we're doing and you're perpetually chasing dollars. So it's good fun, but it's a challenging task at hand that started in our very, very formative days.
Can I ask, you must be pretty good at pitching. No?
Depends who you ask.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave it there because
we don't pitch. I think a lot of non-profits solicit, and I've just come back from the US, and we've been working in the US over there, and there's philanthropy over there is solicitation. It's almost like, I don't want to be too descriptive, but it's all. No, I won't. So it's very visual. It's very intense. It's a show-off market, and it's American style that, I'm going to throw in 25, I'm going to throw in 50. I think we've got a lot more of a British sort of style where it's not a flash. So our pitches aren't solicitation. We take people on a journey and try and access their passion. And if a donor from a guy wearing his nail painted and wants to give $50 to an individual like Peter Cooper who can give us, $250,000 per annum, it's about understanding that what they're passionate about. Is that aligned with the work we're doing? Fantastic, let's have a conversation. So it's less about a pitch, it's more about a relationship than just a hardcore, American style philanthropy. We want you to donate because these kids are over there. It's a lot more about relationship development than a direct pitch.
Brilliant. Well, it's pretty much the answer I kind of wanted to make some sort of correlation between startups pitching venture capital versus pitching to raise funds for something much more important.
I think the correlation is you've got to sell yourself. But what's the fine line between authenticity and humility? And I think we do it well in this country. I was talking to Ryan before. I think the British lean too much on the humility side, where it is soft and reserved, and you don't sell yourself. And I really respect that. It's quite a nice environment. The Americans, with all respect to any Americans, lean a lot more. I won't say inauthentic, but it's a lot more hardcore sell. So we did a fundraising event last week in New York, and it's you. Every conversation, you've got to sell yourself. You've got to tell them how successful you are, what you've done, how many employees you've got, how much you're turning over. And it's a discomfort for us. So I think the correlations between startup, whatever model you're using, non-profit, hybrid, social enterprise, for-profit, for impact, I think it's just being authentic and being able to sell yourself in a way that still expresses humility.
Yeah, I love the word relationship that you use too, because it's very much about building relationships. It's piece of advice that the Startup Grind founder gave me the other day, early on, was all about relationship. He's like, the minute you ask a venture capitalist for money, everything's going to change, your relationship with them. So he's like, just be careful that you want to do that. So moving forward, you're in the corporate world. You're kind of doing this part-time. You got these great projects that you're doing on your holidays. What's next, and when did you? Well, When was the first big win for you, aside from maybe the 50K project?
I mean, the big wins are always programmatic stuff. Within a year and a half of operations, we're working in 3 countries. So our first 3 countries were Malawi, Ghana, and then we moved to Cambodia. Always through partnerships. And our development model, even though it's shifted and changed, has always been finding and backing local projects.
Is that you going to Scout a bit?
Well, our model now is we use entrepreneurship to solve some of the world's biggest problems. So we find and back local impact ventures in local communities under a fundamental belief that local people have the answers to local problems. We here in Australia are not going to solve problems in Metukulu, South Africa, Lilongwe, Malawi, Kirikrachi in Ghana, Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And so many non-profits in the industry that I work in, international development, still don't realise that. And it's mind-blowing how many groups have a neo-colonial approach to development, which is reinforcing post-World War II colonialism, which is we're educated. I've been to the best universities, and I'm not saying the mindset that people have, whether you're in Britain, Australia, Switzerland, Sweden, US, the assumption is just because you're education, you know how to solve problems related to engineering, water, sanitation, healthcare, education. And we're challenging that norm. We're not the only group. There's other groups out there that share our belief. But Patrick and I were just at a conference in Mexico, and a Nigerian lady said to Patrick, of 430 people at this conference, you're the only Caucasian person I've met that gets it. So many of these international development groups that are still working off a neo-colonial approach, which is we're educated, we're smart, we've got the best engineers, we're going to solve your water problem in Metukulu, South Africa. And it's like, well, you're not. You don't know the local context. You haven't lived there. You haven't experienced the problem. So for us, our model is finding and backing these local impact ventures who are run by local entrepreneurs. Most have lived experience in the community. And so that's important to us. In terms of your question, big wins are, we've had big fundraising wins, we've had ability to scale to new countries, but the big wins are seeing some of these ventures grow. I was just expressing to these two at the front prior to starting, and a way to see a startup. So we back these early stage impact ventures. We take them through a 4-step process: finding, supporting, accelerating, and growing. Finding, accelerating, supporting, and growing. So it's a 4-step process to try and take a local venture at a very early stage and help them scale. Scale for us, irrespective of turnover, is about how do you improve more lives. So these ventures are solving problems connected to poverty, healthcare, education, good homes and housing, job creation. So big wins are when you're in the trenches with an early stage impact venture who's 6 months into their venture and they've got this lived experience with criminals, or they're working with disabled kids in Kibera slum, or they're working with kids in Takani slum that have had no access to education since they were 5 years old. And then over the next 2 years, as you work with them and you're seeing their venture scale, and they might get access to our growth grant, and that can help them go from, a volunteer organisation to 3 or 4 staff members, and then that validates their model, and then they've got more philanthropy or investment that comes in. So the big wins are always seeing more and more lives improved by backing ventures that at a very early stage no one else is willing to support.
And is that even more noticeable because they're so far away that you might not go see that location over 2 years later and go, wow, holy shit, this has happened in the whatever time period it has since I've been there last?
Yeah, I mean, it's less about me visiting. We have local staff in each country we work in. So presently, 4 countries where we've got local teams set up, local staff who are from that country working with local entrepreneurs. So it's not about us going and running programs. Our local staff deliver a lot of our programs. But video content, social media, we're seeing their growth. Impact reports, we're very strict with how we measure impact and therefore make our ventures really accountable to quarterly impact reports, so we can track the level of impact, how many kids are getting access to an education, and ensure that we can see that on a quarterly basis. But yeah, just being able to experience that, not necessarily personally. I get to go to the field at least sort of once a year, but at least for our team, to sit back and see how some of these ventures are growing, and therefore how many lives are being improved by the work that they're doing in the field.
So moving forward, if you don't mind sharing the story with Thea, is it all right? And just how, if I'm missing something critical in between, please let's do that story first. But if I can move to, say, Polish Man and the story with Thea.
Yeah, certainly. So that I guess emanates from an experience I had in September 2013. We worked at the time with an organisation called Ygap International. Ygap, the only way of describing Ygap is they work on the front line of human vulnerability, and still visiting a lot of non-profits, the ventures, 330 plus ventures that we've backed around the world, the different partners we had pre our new development model. Ygap work with issues that I've never experienced before. So they work with kids coming out of the most traumatised situations. So kids that have been trafficked through pedophile rings, kids that have had the worst domestic violence abuse, kids that have had acid burns and forced to beg on the street. You're talking about children across Mekong Delta specifically, but Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and now Afghanistan, that other NGOs cannot even support, and other NGOs turn to Ygap International as a specialist trauma recovery agency. And we proudly partnered with them for a few years, working in Phnom Penh, and we took a donor, Gordon Duncan, to visit the fieldwork, and his son Scott, who's been involved with Ygap. And Scott to meet a bunch of beneficiaries. At this particular evening, we had 21 or 22 kids aged between about 8 and 13 come to a pizza restaurant along the Mekong River. We had pizzas and soft drinks, and got to sit and meet a bunch of the young kids. I was sort of randomly placed next to a 10-year-old girl named Thea. And Thea speaks no English, and my Khmer is limited to about 2 or 3 words. So it was a conversation exchanged through arts and craft and playing games. And so we sort of bonded and had a great night. She picked up a texter and innocently drew a love heart on my hand before flipping my hand over and colouring my nails in. And so thanks to Thea, I left with 10 brightly painted nails that night. The next day, we were at the Catch-Up Learning School, which sort of educates 134 kids in a very unique schooling system. Most of these kids, due to their trauma, either homeless, forced to beg on the streets, trafficked through pedophile rings, and have luckily come out of some pretty horrific industries, but most have had limited to no access to an education. So it's a 2-year bridging school before they get reintegrated or, for the first time, integrated into a government school. We were there, and Caroline, our project partner, who works for Ygap, had said to me, "Elliot, do you know Thea's story?" And I said, no, I wasn't appropriate to ask a supervisor last night. Caroline went on to tell me that Thea, 2 years ago, at 8 years old, her father had passed away. Mother was unable to look after her, father being the sole breadwinner, and was forced out of necessity to take Thea to an orphanage to be given a safe refuge. For the next 2 years, Thea was given everything but a safe refuge. She was physically and sexually abused every day by the director of the orphanage. It was a French guy who ran the orphanage, and I guess that's a significant lost innocence. There is little fortune attached to this story, but what fortune exists was that Thea was taken into Ygap's care because the orphanage was closed down, and he was prosecuted for a $5,000 bribe. He skipped the country and went back to France, which is a testament to the broken sort of legal system that exists in Cambodia. But Thea was taken into Ygap's care. What struck me with this story, just to wrap it up, is Thea, when Caroline had said to me, we work off a very strict development model here, where of our 310 staff globally, 97% are local people. And here in Cambodia, 97% of our staff are local Khmer people. Of our 3% of international staff, none are male. Thea's only been in our care for 6 weeks, and Caroline sort of innocently just said, look, you're potentially the first Western male Thea's met since going through this ordeal. And it just struck me, and I said, look, Caroline, please tell Thea when I return home to Australia, which is next week, I'll continue wearing nail polish. And so by then, October 2013, I started wearing nail polish on one fingernail, and it enabled me to have conversations about meeting Thea and the experience I had with Thea, which is an interesting social experiment. I was 28 years old at the time, turning up to pre-season football training with bright nail polish on was an interesting social experiment. I was captain of the club, but my mates didn't care less. There was a lot of sort of questions of why I was wearing nail polish. Over time, that enabled me to have conversations and advocate on behalf of Hagar International, which led our team, including Kylie Wallace, who's now the global campaign manager for the Polished Man campaign, to look into this issue further. And what we found was an incredible amount of organisations like Hagar International that work on the supply end of kids affected by violence. So trauma recovery, reintegration, education programs, how to support kids that have been affected by this horrifying issue of physical and or sexual violence. We found very few organisations over here, the demand end, how to mitigate the risk of kids actually being affected by violence. And for us, the campaign was clear because the stats were horrifying. And they were, for us, even working in this sector of non-profit, 1 in 5 kids globally, 18.4% of kids affected by violence, a UN conservative estimate. Some groups estimate it's closer to 26, 27% of kids that won't reach their 18th birthday without facing violence. More specifically, 1 child dying every 5 minutes as a result of violence. Why we run a campaign targeted on men is because of the statistics. 90% globally, an estimated 90% of global violence perpetrated against children is from men. The US have the clearest stats, and it's 88% per annum of violence against children perpetrated by men. So we did a virtual desktop research and found very few organisations, 2 or 3, I think, globally, that are engaging men to try and end this issue. So we flicked on a website 12 months later, September 2014, to try and engage men to have a conversation about ending violence against children. That was successful, and fast forward 3 years, we've just completed our 4th campaign.
Brilliant. Oh, that's where the collaborator. So can you walk through, like, this has been pretty successful, right? It's been it's a great campaign. You've got a lot of celebrities behind it now. You know, I used pictures of Chris Hemsworth and Zac Efron trying to get people to, you know, give me money, guilt them into it, whatever it was to get the job done. Tell me about the growth of Polished Man and some of the success you've had or the impact you've had as a result.
I mean, yeah, great question. Look, first year raised $250,000, engaged 1,300 men to paint a fingernail. Second year, $374,000 raised off 3,400 men. A third year last year was our sort of breakout year, raised $1 million, had close to 70,000 men across 94 countries paint their fingernail and engage with the campaign, which, to put in perspective, is quite phenomenal because we had 1 person work on this campaign. A bunch of agencies and support, but 1 person worked tirelessly for 6 to 7 months on a campaign that had participants in 94 countries and raised $1 million. This year we're 2 weeks away from announcing the results, but it's been bigger and better than last year. Irrespective of that, which is good, the leadership piece is really important. Yep, Chris Hemsworth, we had, DeAndre Jordan, Zac Efron, Kelly Slater, Malcolm Turnbull, to his credit this year, painted his fingernail. I really appreciate that type of advocacy, but it's not about just those type of leaders. This is looking at the positive aspects of masculinity, and every male needs to be a leader in addressing this issue. Every male is a leader in some form of community, in their workplace, in their local sport club, in their home. So we use the power of ambassadors to advocate, but it really is about trying to focus on the positive aspects of masculinity. So we don't point fingers at male and say, you're all causing this problem, you've got to do something about it. It's not a negative campaign. It's actually understanding that most men don't commit violence. Most don't. But all men can play a role in addressing violence. And so by getting men to paint one fingernail to represent the one child dying every 5 minutes, as you've probably experienced, Chris, in the past month, builds a conversation. People ask, why have you got your nail painted? Your first opportunity is to talk about the statistics, how many kids are affected by violence. That leads to an education. Oh, I had no idea. Wow, that's horrifying. Tell me more. That education then leads to awareness, which of course informs attitudes and behaviours. So it's a systematic approach that we're trying to do on two fronts. The strong piece there is the advocacy, getting guys to have tough conversations about a topic that we're not comfortable talking about. And I say that we're not comfortable talking about it because this wasn't on the national agenda 10 years ago. We weren't talking about violence against children, domestic violence, child abuse, and I credit deeply Rosie Batty and the courage she's had after the tragic passing of her son Luke, and putting this issue on the national agenda. And now, as mental health has developed into a national conversation, and Australia is very, very progressive at talking about mental health. I just spent a few months in UK earlier this year, and they're not talking about mental health like we are. I really believe that the next national conversation can and will be ending violence against children. And so we're one small player in that large jigsaw puzzle to try and solve this problem. But our focus is, how do we build a community of men here in Australia and around the world that are willing to say no? Looking at men as leaders, looking at men as role models, looking at men as change makers, looking at men as protectors, knowing that there's a natural tendency men have to protect children. So yes, Zach and Chris and others are fantastic, but it's about the 70,000+ men that signed up last year, the tens of thousands that will do it this year, the millions of conversations that are generated from tens of thousands of men painting their fingernail, and women, which we've engaged with the campaign this year. Then importantly, the fundraising too. And so just quickly, there's two ways that we use the funds, through trauma prevention and trauma recovery. So our first step, last year about 70% of the money was focused on trauma prevention. How do we mitigate the risk of kids being affected by violence? Keeping kids in school, access to clean drinking water, making sure they've got a safe home to sleep in, keeping parents in a job. That is to focus on poverty alleviation, which is one of the root causes behind violence. It's not the only root cause. There's a multitude of root causes that leads to violence, but it's one of the major root causes. Children are more susceptible to violence when they're living in impoverished circumstances. So through our programs, by ensuring kids have access to healthcare, education, housing, that mitigates the risk of them being affected by violence. Whilst the other 30% pro rata, but 30% last year will be spent on trauma recovery. So there's already kids in some pretty shitty circumstances, as we know, the levels of violence that exist. How do we back the best practiced organisations around the world? Hagar's International along the Mekong River Delta region. In Australia, we back and support the Australian Childhood Foundation, Mutuklong Network in South Africa, Sambara Foundation in Kenya, New York Centre for Children in the US. So it's a two-pronged approach to say, let's try and help kids before they're affected by this issue, whilst supporting kids that are already affected by the issue.
Fantastic. I want to take a few questions, because I'm not so selfish with everything, but we may have covered a bit of this. What was the hardest thing about starting Ygap?
That's a really good question. I'd say accepting your own potential. I never saw myself as a leader. Part of me still doesn't. I nearly got kicked out of high school. I was a little shit. Teachers hated me. The fact I turned up back to my high school to speak a few years ago shocked a few teachers. I was suspended 6 times, so they let me stay because I think they realised that I was behind being a smartass. I was actually semi-smart. But I rejected authority. I hated teachers. I rejected my parents' authority. Sort of post traveling and starting Ygap with a group of 10 friends, I guess I was pushed out the front, and I was like, well, yeah, I wasn't a CEO at 23, it was like, you'll be the leader. I'm like, why? Why don't one of you guys do it? And then sort of doing that, sort of fast forward 9 years, sort of growing into your potential. That first year led to an anxiety attack. I never had suffered any form of health problems in terms of mental health problems. I had an anxiety attack after 1 year, leading up to our major gala, because I didn't want to do a speech. And I was just like, I didn't see myself as a leader. And I didn't really want to be a leader. I sort of got thrown into it and had to work through the difference in perception that I had for myself versus the expectations, perceptions others had of me. And there's a vast difference. And I worked with a phenomenal coach, only a few sessions, Gayla Maxwell, to try and reconcile that. And there's other hard parts, stuff that had failed, endless hours up to 2 or 3 a.m. whilst I was working full time. Sacrificing personal life, having a few relationships break up because of my commitment to work. There's a host of things in there, but I would probably say, just off the cuff, that accepting my role as a leader was the hardest part.
Can I ask, I guess, as a secondary point to that, you've talked about the story and some pretty hardcore situations with some of these kids. Imagine that's fucking hard too, right? How do you how do you deal with that and not let you affect you, or are you detaching yourself? How do you, but you still need to be, how are you dealing with that and then still, thriving? Do you know what I mean? Walking that line between, I've got to get the job done, but I also, I care.
Yep. So I mean, it's difficult. Daily I'll read articles about child abuse, and from our partners, from the media and everything else. It's an issue that I care about. It's an issue that affects me indirectly, and it pains me to know that a child is stripped of their childhood and their innocence to virtue of male perpetrated violence. So they're heavy subjects. The violence against children, even the issues we work at more broadly with Ygap around poverty. We had a team session today on culture. Ryan had a great point about making sure that we keep things fun. And so a lot of for those that have been to a Ygap event or Polish Man event, we do keep things fun. They're really energetic, they're fun, group of young Australians that like getting shit done. They work hard, but it's a unique balance. It's not your overtly serious do-gooders that are trying to change the world. We're young, we enjoy having a good time on the weekend. It's a social environment. So I think it's finding that balance. More personally, I've escaped through playing football and travelling and having good friendships. More recently, I live with a global meditation teacher, and it's taken him 2 years, but he's finally got me to meditate, and really enjoying that on a daily basis.
That's how long it takes?
I was reluctant, and I regret it now, but it was, where do you find 20 minutes in a day?
Yeah, true.
That was my justification. But yeah, there's mechanisms now, and I think it's just having balance. And it took me, I had a sabbatical earlier this year. I spent 6 months overseas because I burnt out, probably going too hard, too fast for too long. And since returning, I've had to just check myself in and go, I don't need to be at work every day till 10 p.m. I can actually look after myself and still be productive. So changing that, and now trying to educate and communicate that to staff that we're still going to do exceptional work without slaving ourselves. And I talked today about service. We're servicing others. We're working so hard for people in communities who don't know how hard we're working here in Melbourne to support them, but we're not servicing ourselves. We're not actually really balancing ourselves with good diet, looking after ourselves in the office and having the right blend of work-life balance. So that's a challenge.
It's a challenge a lot of entrepreneurs facing it too. What's the most important thing Ygap is working towards at the moment in your eyes?
End of 2018, we have an objective to improve the lives of 1 million people living in poverty. So we're sitting at 450,000 lives improved. We're, again, really strict with how we measure a life improved. Giving a child a water bottle and wishing them a good day at school is not a life improved, okay? It's a benefit. And kudos to you, that's great, but that's not a life improved. Giving a child access to both primary and secondary school for 13 years is a life improved. Getting employment for a long-term unemployed South African is a life improved. So we've got those 4 ways: education, healthcare, job creation, and good homes and housing. How we measure lives improved. We sign up to the best global impact reporting mechanisms called IRIS, and are really strict on our quarterly reporting. So 450,000 lives improved since we really started, since we flipped our development model in 2015 and started measuring it sincerely. And so it's hopefully a bit of a hockey stick, because the next 12 months we want to improve 500,000 people's lives living in poverty.
Brilliant. I was born in an African city that had a population of 4 million. Today it is 26 million. People are poorer than during colonialism. Any comments? If you want to answer that or not.
I straight away went to think which city that would be. Lagos. It's too big for Nairobi. Is that person here? I'd love to know which city. Which city? Cairo. That is a big African city. Very big African city. So what was the second half of the question? I got lost with the numbers. I'm an accountant, sorry.
My grandfather and his twin brother were a bit like you. They started an orphanage for Coptic kids in Cairo. Still going today. However, Africa is totally, absolutely hopeless. I'm saying this in a very serious way. I'm not trying to run down Africans, because I consider myself an African. But simple metrics like oil consumption per capita is dropping for 20 years. How can people, well-intentioned people, I mean, I bow down to you and all the rest of it, how can well-intentioned people make any real difference?
It's a great question. I think what's most important to note is my sector, the not-for-profit philanthropic sector, will not solve Africa's problems. We're almost a safety net for those falling right through the cracks. Same as a social welfare net here in Australia. NGOs that are trying to solve these problems, but systematic government change is required too. And unfortunately, Africa suffers from poor governance. There's a Mohammed Ibrahim Award that's awarded to any African leader, $5 million payment, who leaves office at the end of their term. And after 50 years of this award being available, only 3 or 4 African leaders have taken that $5 million. So it's a philanthropist, African English philanthropist, that gives you $5 million if you leave office at the end of your term. But it's a lot more valuable to stay in office with the levels of corruption. So there's not just corruption that's led by internal politics in African countries. The north-south divide is horrifying. For all the money that goes in to Africa, 5x, so 500% more comes out. So all the trade and all the work that we do in our sector to support African economies, the amount of money coming out through mining companies, through corruptions, through trades, of money actually coming out of these resource-rich countries back into the global north. So these are systemic problems that, whilst we're working at the sort of base of the pyramid, trying to support people's lives by ensuring they've got fresh drinking water, access to education, healthcare programs, we need systematic change. And, what your stat there talks about.
What gives you the idea that changing the people on top will change anything? You and I both know very well the people on top don't really control anything.
Yeah, but you would have, if we were sitting here in 1750 France, you've had to ask that question, then a revolution happened and the monarchy got overthrown and there's a republic now. I actually do believe in my lifetime we'll see a flip of capitalism. And I don't want to upset people with that statement, But I do not think the system we have right now, the global inequalities are getting worse and worse. It's built for the very, very rich and wealthy, and we're seeing this right now with the US tax debate. It is not serving the people. Why did Brexit happen? Why did Trump get in office? People are revolting. They're frustrated. They're voting in certain ways. But I do not think that the global political economic system is sustainable. And I assume in my lifetime, we'll see systematic change. It might be a revolt. It might be a political revolution. It may be anarchy. But I do not think...
I agree with everything you said.
We'll take the rest after, at the end.
People having so many kids.
All right. Hang on. All right. At the end, I want to get a few more questions, then we can. No. We'll take it. We'll take a question. He's used to the hard questions.
No, it's good.
What was some of the feedback from the men perpetrating it? That's it's a tough one.
Perpetrating violence?
Yeah.
So it's a very topical issue, and one I can only speak about not through experience, but through what I've learned. And I think that's an important lens to view this problem as. A lot of people that perpetrate violence are victims of violence themselves. It's cyclical, and it's unfortunate that this problem is a recurring problem. Kids that are affected by violence, who sometimes can bury that trauma or who don't deal with that trauma, it doesn't automatically, by any measure, mean that they're going to perpetrate violence, but the levels of perpetrators who have been affected by violence at some point in their life are very, very high. And so it almost is like a generational change. It's not giving up. And I've actually sat with the film director of India's Daughter. I think we'll all remember the horrifying rape of the 23-year-old Indian girl on the school bus, it was a school bus in New Delhi, probably about 4 years ago. I met the producer who put together India's Daughter, and I highly recommend it. It's a 1-hour documentary. If you haven't seen it, I think you can find it online. But she was telling me that we need to be working with kids before they turn 5. Like, it's the emotional intelligence that we're going to be teaching and breaking the traditional education systems to change patterns and behaviours. That for some of the work that we're doing, it's good, but it's too late when we're trying to change men's behaviours once social norms are set. And so I think the question's relating to anyone that's perpetrated violence, their reaction. I hope they look at it and it challenges them to see men walking around the street, men at their footy club, men at their workplace that are wearing nail polish and advocating against violence against children. Hopefully that informs and changes behaviours. But this experience of meeting Leslie is almost saying, no, we've got to go back to this next generation and invest in formative years of kids and teaching them different social norms to try and break the cycle.
Wonderful. Where's Ryan? You want to ask a last question to get it back upbeat, mate? You got a big win that we're working on, or something?
Oh gosh.
It's not a Dorothy Dixer.
It can be. It's all right. Go for it.
I guess what's one of the biggest successes from Polish Man that you've seen directly impact your life?
That's a great question. I'd say Lebahang Bugapani. So for anyone that signed up to the campaign, you may have seen her video. For anyone that had the opportunity, we've got a virtual reality tour. It's difficult and expensive to get people to the field sometimes, so we had a great digital agency film 3 beneficiaries where we work across South Africa, New York and Melbourne. And Lebahang Bugapani is one of the early stage impact ventures that we've backed in the northwest province of South Africa. 7 out of 10 women are affected by violence in the northwest province of South Africa. Horrifying levels of violence. Children affected by the issue too. Lebahang was affected by violence at 8 years old. Her father was abusive to her mother, and her. They were left homeless at 8 years old, literally looking through dumpsters for food. She got an education, but married at 22 years old. Within 6 months of the marriage, her former husband was so abusive to her that she left the marriage, but he tragically passed away from a car accident. So 23 years old, she's homeless for the second time due to violence. 8 years old and 23 years old. Instead of giving up, turning to escapism, drugs, alcohol, and anything in between, she launched a crisis centre called the Mutu Network in the northwest province of South Africa that services women and children affected by this issue. And so we met her at a very early stage, one centre in the northwest province of South Africa. She's now working with 18 or 19 centres, working with 5,000 kids every year that are affected by violence. And we gave her, I think, $25,000 in 2015, and we got another donor to match it. So in 2016, another $50,000. And going back and seeing what she's doing. And this is a woman that often runs out of money, like her whole non-profit with all these centres runs out of money, and she just keeps going and going. She's 30, she's sort of my age, about 31 odd now, and just has this tenacious appetite because she's lived through that problem and that experience, and so she's perpetually just fighting and fighting and fighting. So to know that something simple like $25,000 to $50,000 for her has had such a profound impact on her work is probably the most humbling part of the campaign.
I want everyone back on their feet. Come on. And a big thank you to Elliot for coming. Come on.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.